The fight against terrorism has changed since the 9/11 attacks. Clearly, terrorists have staged different types of attacks on subways, hotels, and with truck bombs. The unrest in Afghanistan is boosting concerns about possible threats resurfacing. Joining us tonight is DePaul University history professor and terrorism analyst Tom Mockaitis. Welcome to Prime. Thank you for being here on this 9/11. Let's start with whether America is safer now than it was 20 years ago.
Well, it's not a simple question. We definitely have reduced the likelihood of Al-Qaeda or any other organization carrying out a catastrophic attack like the one they did on 9/11. However, the terrorists are agile. They've adjusted. They adjusted fairly quickly afterwards, and they continue to hit us with small-level attacks, very similar to ones we've seen perpetrated in the U.S. the last couple of years by both, the last 5 or 6 years, by ISIS supporters, San Bernardino and the Pulse nightclub, but also by far-right extremists, such as the El Paso shooter. It's very hard to stop a lone wolf gunman with improvised explosive devices, high-capacity magazines, and multiple weapons, or a small group of individuals determined to carry out an attack.
So 2 bloody wars have followed, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of the 9/11 families, as we just heard, are suing Saudi Arabia, saying the kingdom provided funding and support for the terrorists, most of whom were Saudi. What role does Saudi Arabia play in the attacks, and did we go after the wrong country?
That's been debated really almost since the attacks themselves occurred. It's not always clear that in a country like Saudi Arabia, you can talk about it monolithically. It may have more than one center of gravity. I think it's extremely likely, actually virtually certain, that some wealthy Saudis, in fact, did support Al-Qaeda and may have been involved in supporting a particular operation. Whether the Saudi government itself did, I think is a lot harder to determine, and I don't know that we'll ever be able to sort that out.
Former President Bush today called out domestic terrorists. Let's take a listen to that, and then I want to get your take on it on the back end.
Yeah.
There is little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home. They are children of the same foul spirit, and it is our continuing duty to confront them.
The current administration obviously echoing that, especially since the Capitol riot. What do you make of that? Should we be focusing on homegrown terrorism?
That's what the FBI said, and I concur based on 30 years of research on terrorism. The odds of being killed by domestic terrorists are significantly greater than dying by a foreign one. Doesn't mean we ignore the threat. The good news, you prepare for one, you prepare for the other. But we really need to focus our attention on far-right groups, militia organizations, Proud Boys, 3%ers, etc., who we saw on full display on January 6th and are still very much out there and very capable of continued mayhem and violence.
Obviously, the internet has evolved and grown since 2001. What role has the internet played, social media played in radicalizing and mobilizing terrorists since that time?
Absolutely a crucial role. People get very hung up on organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The real issue on both the far right in the United States and jihadist Salafism, as they call it, Muslim Islamic extremism on the other, is the ideology, not the groups. And social media makes it extremely easy to spread the ideology throughout the world. We know that the Christchurch mosque shooter, who was a far-right extremist, Omar Mateen, who was a supporter of ISIS, and the shooter in El Paso, Texas, who was also a far-right extremist, all had no affiliation to any particular group. All appear to have been radicalized via social media and the internet.
Last month, President Biden described cybersecurity as the core national security challenge. We've already experienced recent examples of this. Do you anticipate more attacks on our digital infrastructure? And how big of a threat is that?
I expect more, but I consider that to be primarily criminality and espionage, not terrorism. Most of the attacks are state on state, or criminal organizations, or a synergy between the two. For example, the Russian attacks, the Russian criminal attacks, which may or may not have had support or at least tacit allowance by the Kremlin. That's really not, it's not clear that's terrorism. That's clearly espionage, it's criminality, but it's a somewhat different animal than than what we see with groups like ISIS or the far right extremists in the U.S.
All right, Dr. Mockaitis, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I appreciate having you.
Happy to do it.